Hello and welcome to RCSI University of Medicine and Health Sciences. My name is Dr. Mary Collins and I'm delighted to be joining you today to chair this session. This is the second in a three-part series, the MyHealth Positive Health mini-series. And tonight's topic is managing coronaphobia, staying present. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Trudy Meehan. Trudy is a senior clinical psychologist specialising in child and adolescent mental health and a lecturer in the RCSI Centre for Positive Psychology and Health. We're also joined today by Dr. Porrick Dunn, immunologist, practicing psychotherapist, meditation teacher and lecturer in the RCSI Centre for Positive Psychology and Health. Dr. Porrick Dunn will commence the event with a short presentation to provide an overview of our topic this evening.
So thanks again, Mary. Today we're actually going to discuss what I think is a very prescient topic that affects not just me and my family and my friends, but all of us during these very difficult times. And I've entitled this very short talk, Managing Coronaphobia. And although there is a primary focus on fear of the coronavirus itself and the current pandemic, this really applies to all forms of anxiety. So hopefully the coronaphobia will eventually diminish and the pandemic will be resolved. But anxiety amongst human nature is never going to be fully resolved, unfortunately. So I think the tools that we'll discuss in this short talk can be applied not just to fear of the coronavirus or the pandemic, but all sorts of fear that we all experience every day, really, for many of us. And we're really going to have a particular focus on staying present and practical tools and how we can stay present. And it turns out that staying present is actually the antidote to many forms of anxiety. So I want to just run through a number of little questions here. And as I'm going through them, I want you to think in your mind, have you experienced any of those things in the past? Are you experiencing any of them now? Do you know anybody who's experienced them? They're all very common symptoms. As a psychotherapist, I would see these symptoms all the time. During the current pandemic, they're probably rising in a little bit of a spike, but have a look, see if there's anything familiar here, and we'll give a more in-depth explanation once I go through them. So right now, have you experienced in the past or right now or known anybody who experienced these symptoms? So an inability to maintain focus while reading a book, for example. So what I mean by that is that if you like to read, maybe you like to read at bedtime, you open the book and you can only get halfway through a paragraph before you've realized, I can't remember what the previous paragraph is about. Have you experienced an inability to maintain focus while watching a film or TV show or your favorite Netflix series? Do you find that when you're in conversation with family members or friends or colleagues that you're tuning out of the conversation and you're forgetting details and you've no memory, for example, of the last 2 or 3 minutes? Have you, and I know we're all pretty limited to where we can drive at the moment, but have you found yourself ever driving somewhere, let's say on the road to Dublin when you should have been on the road to Cork, that kind of thing? Have you mislaid keys? Have you left keys in the front door, for example? Do you forget your car keys repeatedly on a daily basis for a period of time, for example? Have you left pots on the cooker to burn, for example, if you were boiling a couple of eggs and you left the water boil off? So the chances are that if you have been experiencing any of those symptoms, that you don't have a brain disease like dementia or that you're developing Alzheimer's disease, for example. The chances is that something is making you absent from the present moment. Now, I would introduce one caveat here. I think it's always prudent that if you are experiencing a lot of these symptoms on a daily basis over a long period of time, such as, for example, more than 6 weeks, it's prudent to pay a visit to your GP and just to make sure that there's no physical disease process going on here, which most likely there aren't for most of us. So the reality here is that in the absence of something like a disease like dementia or Alzheimer's, what's happening is there's something in your reality, and I think we all know what that might be at the moment, that's making you absent from the present moment. So speaking of the unspeakable, we're really talking about COVID-19 at the moment. We're talking about this global pandemic that's affecting all of us. Nobody gets out of this unscathed. So When anxiety is present over long periods of time, and I've written here 6 weeks, so usually that's the kind of ballpark that we're looking at here. When you're feeling and experiencing these kind of symptoms over longer than 6 weeks, generally speaking, many of us have a tendency to start locking our thinking processes, either ruminating over past events or worrying about an uncertain future. And there really isn't anything more uncertain right now, at least, than a COVID-19 related pandemic and what can happen to all of us in society as a result of this pandemic. So this pandemic obviously is associated with a myriad of different uncertainties, instabilities, and associated fears. And these fears lock us in this kind of position where we're either ruminating over the past, as I said, but during a pandemic, it's really more about worrying about an uncertain future for ourselves, for our family members, for our colleagues, for the world at large, for example. So the bottom line here is that the brain is a fantastic organ. The mind that's linked to the brain is fantastic. It has helped us evolve over the thousands of years into the intelligent creatures that we are. However, it's not some kind of miracle machine. So if you're getting it to do many different things at the same time and you're multitasking to an extreme level, yeah, it can help you out as much as it can, but it can't do everything. So I've written here that the brain can only do so much when your conscious awareness is projecting into an uncertain future. So if you're, for example, if you're writing a report or you're trying to write a report and maybe you've got one of your kids over in the corner and they're watching something on YouTube related to school and you're trying to focus, but at the same time you're ruminating over what might happen about your job in the future in relation to COVID-19, or whether maybe you've got a sick relative or whether you'll get infected, your brain can only do so much. It can't do everything. So the brain, as we all know, it helps to beat our heart, it helps our lungs to breathe, it helps our digestion, helps us to do all sorts of wonderful things. Without it, we wouldn't be able to stand up, never mind do anything at all. But it can only do so much. So inevitably, low priority tasks that are not associated with keeping us alive, like breathing and having our heart beat and keeping us standing up and our eyes open, they fall to the wayside. And these things are trivial to the brain when it can only do so much. So in other words, when you are multitasking, but at the same time you're projecting into an uncertain future, your brain is going to tune out certain things. And that means you're going to leave a set of keys in the front door. That means you're going to put some eggs into a pot of cold water, you're going to turn on the stove, and you're going to leave it there because you're ruminating constantly. And the brain can only do so much. So the good news is that there's nothing wrong with you. As I said, it's always prudent to check with the GP, but we're going to assume that there's nothing physically wrong with you in terms of brain disease. And for most of us, thankfully, there isn't. The problem is you're just having trouble staying in the present moment. That's really the issue here. So when we project into the future, as I said, and you're worrying about uncertain events, you're going to activate the stress response in your body. So what do I mean when I say the stress response? What I mean is that thinking itself can initiate cascades and chain reactions of stress hormones in the brain that flood out into the bloodstream, that then target many different organs in our body, such as the adrenal glands. And then we get production of stress hormones like cortisol, you might have heard of that before, but also really the master regulator of stress, which is adrenaline. So merely thinking and worrying about an uncertain future will start this cascade in the body where we initiate the stress response. And the bad news here is that the poor old brain can't tell the difference between a paper tiger and a real tiger sitting in front of it if you tell the brain that the paper tiger is just as much of a threat. So that means then that your thinking process can set off exactly the same stress cascades as a real event sitting in front of you, like a rabid dog or a lion or a tiger, for example. So imagine if you're spending a few hours a day worrying about an uncertain future, you're going to be constantly activating these cascades in your brain that have an impact on your body. And this means you're going to be permanently on high alert. And that's generally not good news for either the head or the body itself. So it's really important for you to realize, and for all of us to understand, that for the brain, perception is as important as reality. So what that means is that if you think something and you tell the brain that this thought is a significant threat, well, then it's going to produce exactly the same stress hormones as it would as if a rabid dog was sitting in front of you and was going to bite you. So I want to dip in very briefly, and it's our mission at the Centre for Positive Psychology and Health at the College of Surgeons. where we like to focus on evidence-based practices. And we like to, every now and again, throw in some research papers or research reviews where individuals have studied these concepts so that we can be fairly confident that the things we're trying to talk to you about are actually based in good, hard science. And that's what I'm going to talk to you very briefly about now in the coming slides. So really what we're talking about here is that this ruminating over uncertain future is really linked to the mind wandering aimlessly into an uncertain but scary future. We're telling the brain there's a scary future, and we're alerting all of our stress responses. So there is a link, and the theme of the number of this series of talks is really happiness and the science of happiness. And really what we're talking about here is the link between the wandering mind, the mind that is projecting into an uncertain future, and happiness. And it turns out that individuals have studied this in detail. So this is a fantastic study that was done actually over 10 years ago now by scientists at Harvard University. And I put the link here. So if you are interested, you can go off and you can get access to this paper, which is very interesting. And what these researchers did was they got access to quite a large number of individuals. And interestingly enough, this study is actually still going on. So you can actually go onto their website and take part if you'd like to do that. But at the point of actually producing this research article, they'd studied 2,250 adults over a number of months. And that's quite a number of people to study in for any research project. And what they did was they asked people to download a smartphone application. And this smartphone app then would check in with the individual randomly throughout the day. And it would ask you a number of questions. It would ask you, what are you doing right now? So maybe you were, I don't know, sweeping up the kitchen. It would ask you how you're feeling right now. And it would give you a question with 0 to 10, 0 being very unhappy, 10 being the happiest you've ever been. So it's asking you to score how happy you are in that moment. And then the third question it asked you was, are you wandering in terms of your mind? Are you projecting into the future? Are you daydreaming? Are you thinking about something in the past? So it asked those 3 questions randomly throughout the day to 2,250 people over a number of months. And a number of very interesting, at least for me anyway, findings came from this. And the first one was that people's minds wandered frequently, as you might imagine, and that was regardless of what they were doing. And almost 50% of every time this app checked in with the individuals, that individual was experiencing a wandering mind. So again, projecting into the future or wandering back into the past. Now, I would imagine, and we haven't seen any studies to date in the current pandemic, but I would imagine that percentage is actually a little bit higher now. And so I'd be interested to see in the next year or so research based on how people's minds are wandering during this point in time. But suffice it to say anyway, for this particular study, you're talking about almost 50% of individuals, when randomly checked in with this app, their minds were wandering at that time. And what these researchers found was that people were less happy when their minds were wandering than when they were not. So in other words, people were no happier when thinking about pleasant topics. Now that's a very interesting point for me. So what that means is that when your mind is wandering about negative things, yeah, it stands to reason that might make us unhappy. But what these researchers found was that even people daydreaming about lying on a beach and a holiday in the up and coming summer or whatever that might be, in other words, a pleasant topic, that they weren't any more happy than they were when they were thinking negative thoughts. So that's a very significant finding. So that means that the mind just wandering, no matter where it's going, but wandering in general, does not lead to happiness. In fact, it's associated with unhappiness. So this is another important point. These researchers found that the mind wandering was generally the cause and not merely the consequence of unhappiness. It's a really, really important point. So the wandering mind, in terms of projecting to an uncertain future or ruminating about something at the past, whether that's positive or negative, usually led to unhappiness at that given point in time. And what people were thinking was a better predictor of happiness than what they were doing. That's another really important point. So how do we stop this process? And I'm going to give you a relatively long list of tools that you can engage in that you probably would have engaged in. They're relatively accessible, but what we find is from the research that all of these tools can really help us with the mind wandering. And the first set of clues that we can get from this is by looking at this particular research article that these researchers conducted in Harvard. And what we find is, when we look at this research paper, is that people were actually at their happiest when they were engaging in these activities down here. So needless to say, when people are working on their computers and things like that, or watching television, they're not necessarily happy. But when they're engaging in these activities, these researchers found that their minds were wandering less and they were more happy. So the clues are here. So what are those activities? And the bottom line here is that we need to stop the mind from wandering, because we know from these researchers that a wandering mind is not a happy mind, whether that's wandering into negative or positive types of topics. So how can we anchor the mind down to stay in the present moment? And the longer we can stay in the present moment, the happier we're going to be in general. The longer we can stay in the present moment, the less chance these stress cascades in our brains are going to be initiated, the less chance these stress hormones are produced in our body, which can damage us over time, and the less chance that we're going to be forgetful or inattentive in the future. So what are these tools that you can engage in? So number one, and this is not in order of importance, but nevertheless, I would personally believe that one of the most important activities you can engage in to anchor yourself in the present moment is to engage in exercise. Now, I know that in most gyms, and right now none of us can actually go to a gym, but I know from most gyms, and especially the one that I used to go to, that people are on treadmills and they're on running machines and they have a bank of television screens in front of them. And what they're doing is they're watching the news or they're watching their favorite TV show as they're running. That's not what's called conscious exercise. That's still, it's actually encouraging the mind to wander when you engage in that kind of activity and that kind of exercise. So when I'm talking about conscious exercise, I'm talking about being in the present when you're running, when you're walking, if you're on a rowing machine, if you're doing aerobics, if you're doing something like yoga, which will really get you to ground you in the present moment. The bottom line here is this is not just random exercising. This is exercising with conscious awareness. So when you run, you're running and you're feeling your feet hit the pavement. You're feeling your heartbeat. You're feeling the air going in and out of your lungs. You're feeling yourself getting hot. You're noticing the environment around you. Conscious exercise, not mindless exercise. So there's no point in running and daydreaming again about something in the future or ruminating over the past. Another one you might be surprised by is singing. One of the best things you can do for mental health in general is engage in a choir and engage in singing. We don't have time to go into all the science behind this, but suffice it to say that when you engage in singing and regulating your breathing process, you're really calming down what's called your autonomic nervous system. And when you do this, you're really doing your brain a favor and you're calming down the stress response. If you engage in singing, whether that's by yourself or with friends or in a choir, you're really forcing your mind to stay in the present moment. It's a very, very healthy activity to engage in if you can sing. I'm not a great singer, but if you can, this is a fantastic activity to engage in. Now, here's where we really open the whole can of worms. All sorts of creative acts. All you have to do is look at a toddler, for example, painting a picture with a crayon, or engaging in a coloring book, or drawing, or whatever that might be. Kids and animals are very good at staying in the present moment when they're engaged in activities like this, and we have a lot to learn from them. If we engage in creative acts like drawing, painting, I've just given a few here, you can probably list another 10 on top of this. And it's even down to solving puzzles, for example. These things, when they're done with focus and attention, ground us in the present moment. Think of this big anchor here. All of these activities anchor us down in this present moment. I would also include engaging in amateur dramatics. You probably aren't going to be able to do that right now during a lockdown, but theatre, for example, is a really good thing, and it's been shown, a lot of the research has shown that theatre, amateur dramatics, drama of any kind is a really positive thing for mental health. If you're interested in it and if you can do it, it really helps to profoundly ground you in the present moment. Fantastic anchor. Cooking is another fantastic anchor. Again, just like exercise, not mindless cooking where you're chopping mushrooms and again you're projecting into the future, but really being present in the kitchen with the mushrooms, being present with the peppers, smelling it, feeling the textures, popping them into the pan, experiencing what you're doing, experiencing the kitchen in the present moment. Cooking is grounding you then, not mindless cooking. Mindfulness in general and meditation in general, and I'm probably going to bore you a little bit with this because it's a bit of a favorite of mine, But mindfulness and meditation for me is the gold standard kind of activity for grounding you and anchoring you in the present moment. But if you can engage in mindful eating as opposed to a wandering mind as you're chomping down into a very nice pizza, for example, and again, you're projecting into an uncertain future where you're worrying or you're ruminating over the past, we're talking about enjoying that slice of pizza. We're talking about savoring every single bite, being present in that moment. That's what mindful eating really means. Now, I mentioned meditation before, and I'm going to give you a very brief overview of what I mean by meditation in a moment. If you're religious and you pray, well, you need to continue to pray. And actually, you should bring prayer into your daily life, because all the research has shown as well that prayer is absolutely fantastic at grounding you as an individual into the present moment, really focusing you down, especially things like the rosary, for example. People have done research on that. And just as much as mantra meditation or other types of meditation are very, very effective at anchoring you and grounding you in the present moment, that stops you projecting and wandering away into the future or the past. Here's another really interesting point. Usually with the wandering mind, we have a tendency for the spotlight to shine inward about ourselves. It becomes very much about ourselves. Even if we're worrying about somebody else, it's still linked to ourselves. This spotlight shines inward, and then it projects into the future where we're involved, or it ruminates about the past, again, where we're involved. If you can somehow get this spotlight to shine outward on other people, then that will ground you and anchor you in the present moment as well. And what I mean by that is really, really listening to the individual. So not half listening, not projecting or waiting for your chance to say something, but actually sitting back and allowing that individual to talk to you, and you're open and actively engaged in what they're saying. Try this with a friend, try this with a loved one, try this with your partner, with colleagues, with children, with everybody. This can really help ground you in the present moment as well. And linked to that is volunteering. And it's probably quite difficult to do this at the moment, but volunteering is really an extension of active listening. When you can focus on another human being, especially another human being who needs you in some way, then that can help ground you as well. Now, that's not to say that you should spend your time worrying about that individual projecting into the future. I mean, genuinely being present with these individuals in whatever volunteering context you're engaged in. So I mentioned meditation. And again, I'm just going to very briefly go through this type of meditation that we call attention-based training. And the reason I'm showing you this slide right now is that I have personal experience with this. I know this has worked for me over probably 30 years now. I engage in this practice every day. It has saved my mind and my body in numerous ways. I have brought clients through this in a psychotherapeutic context. I brought patient groups through this in a research context. I can promise you that this works. For me, this is the gold standard for training a brain to stay in the present moment, to anchor you in the moment. Now, all the other things are fantastic as well, but I'm just giving you this example here because I know this inside out and I know it works. And what we're talking about here in attention-based training is adopting an upright posture, an upright position, so that you're giving the signal to your brain to be alert. This type of practice is not about relaxation or sleep. This is work. And what we do is, in terms of an anchor to help us stay in the present moment, because remember, the nature of the mind is to wander all over the place. We use one of two anchors in attention-based training. So you can use the breath, which is always moving, regardless of what's happening. And each time you become distracted, and each time you wander down that river in terms of worrying about the future, you come back to the anchor, that's the breath. Or you can come back to what's called a chosen phrase. And a chosen phrase can be anything. The example that we usually give is, I am here now. And if you say this over and over again, this will ground you into the present moment. Each time you become distracted, as I've written up here, you disengage from thought, from an emotion, from a sensation like an itchy foot, from a memory of something that was maybe negative in the past, or something that's uncertain in the future, and you return to your anchor. And whether that anchor is the breath or a chosen phrase like I am here now, this will help ground you in the present moment. So the very basic process is 2 minutes, sit in the upright posture, wherever you are, out in the garden, in your kitchen, in your bedroom, wherever you are. You could do it on a bus, anywhere you want. Set the timer for 2 minutes on your phone. You close your eyes. You've chosen your anchor. Don't flip-flop between the two, just pick one. Let's say it's the breath. That's the one I personally prefer, but it doesn't matter. You can choose the chosen phrase either. No need to empty or stop your mind. You can't do that. You can't stop the mind chattering and moving around like a monkey. That's what it does. So you just accept that. And each time you become distracted, you return to your anchor. Your timer will go off. That's your practice done. If you can engage that twice a day for 2 minutes, this will help reset and rewire your mind to help it to stay in the present moment, to stop it wandering. And remember from that research, if we can stop it wandering, then we can become more happy in this activity. If you want access, we've got an 8-week program in attention-based training. You can click on this website here, which is the rcsi.com website, and you'll find links to all sorts of goodies that we have there in relation to this practice and other types of practices that can help. So no matter what you do, whether it's running, whether it's cooking, whether it's coloring, drawing, theater, active listening, whatever you pick, I would really strongly suggest that you put some kind of regimen in place, because we need to train the brain. We need to rewire the brain to help it stay in the present moment, to anchor in the present moment. And I would recommend that no matter what it is, you schedule a time on your phone in the morning and in the evening, just for a few minutes, put the reminders in your phone and engage it. You should also say out loud that I want to remain in the present moment. You should tell your family members, tell your friends, I'm staying in the present moment, because what you're doing by saying that out loud is confirming to your conscious awareness mind that you want to stay in the present. This is my goal. This is my attention. And state this goal daily and bring it into your conscious awareness. Now, we're talking about bookending the day with these practices that help ground you and anchor you in the present moment. Stop the mind wandering if you can. However, there will be times throughout the day that your mind is naturally going to wander. And we need you to catch that. And when you catch it, you can engage in what I would call first aid tactics here to stop the mind from wandering forward. Now, for me, as I mentioned to you, the gold standard is meditation. And you can use your breath, you can use a chosen phrase like I am here now, you can use prayer, and you can describe your immediate surroundings, for example. So if you find it that you're getting quite anxious and you're projecting into the future, what you can do is you can literally sit on the sofa and describe what you're wearing. You can describe the clock ticking. You can describe the wallpaper on your walls. You can describe a dog barking outside. Focus yourself to stay grounded in the present moment. List the counties in Ireland, list the counties in provinces, list the players in your favorite sports team. Keep doing that until your mind engages in the present moment and stops wandering. And one of the last slides I'm going to show you today is really what really for me is the blood that flows through the veins of happiness, and that is compassion. And not just compassion for others, but we must start with compassion for yourself. So especially if you're engaging in any of these processes, if your mind is wandering, that means you're human. That's what we all do. It's the nature of the mind to wander. So don't start giving out to yourself if your mind is wandering. That's what it does. So each time the mind drags you off down the river into a daydream, either into the future or the past, you return to your anchor activity, no matter what that was. Either you're bookending your day, whether that's via cooking or meditating or whatever it is, or you're using those first aid activities that I mentioned in the previous slide. Either way, you come back to the present moment. And it doesn't matter how many times your mind wanders, as long as you return. Once you return, you're changing literally the structure of your brain. Your brain is very plastic. What that means is that it changes. The cells change in it. They grow in different directions. And that's what happens when you learn a language or a musical instrument. It's the same with this kind of practice. Practice makes perfect. The brain is plastic. And I say this an awful lot to clients who feel that they should be experts at this kind of thing, whether it's meditation or whatever it might be, in a few weeks. And that's very unrealistic. The reality here is that if I asked you to learn a language right now, if I asked you to learn Russian and you've never spoken Russian before, or I asked you to play the cello and you've never played a stringed instrument before, even if I bump into you this time next year, you're not going to be fluent and you're not going to be a fantastic cellist. So you need to be realistic with this. It takes time, long periods of time. It doesn't mean that you can't get good at it, but it takes a long period of time. So be compassionate and be patient. So apply the same allowances for practicing these things as you would for staying in the present moment. And the last thing I'll leave you with here is what I think is a fantastic and very prescient phrase by the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, which is, if you're depressed, you're living in the past. And if you're anxious, you're living in the future. If you are at peace, you're living in the present. And for me, that's what it's all about.
Thanks so much, Porrick, for that most insightful presentation. And I think really practical also. You've given us a range of different ways we can anchor ourselves to the present moment. So, Trudy, I'd like to turn to you, please. Obviously, all age groups have been impacted by the pandemic, but I think in particular, children and young people. Could you please share your thoughts on how being mindful and being in the present moment can support the mental health and well-being of our children and young people?
Mary, it's very simple in a way. Basically, everything that Porrig has said about adults staying in the present applies very much to children and young people. And so the only difference, I suppose, is that children and young people rely on us as the caregivers or parents to scaffold and help them with that staying present. So it's a harder task in that they're a little bit, they can get knocked off center if we're not on our center. So as a parent or caregiver, our first task is to follow the steps that Porrig talked about and to try and stay present and find a core and a presence for ourselves. The research is showing that mindfulness is really beneficial for children and young people. Like anything else, when you add something in, if the brain is functioning really well, the benefit's going to be a little bit. If there's some challenges with attention and focus, then the benefits of mindfulness are bigger and better. So Professor Dan Siegel in UCLA has started to do some pilot studies on using mindfulness with young people, specifically teenagers who have attention deficit type presentations. And they're finding that mindfulness is really good for bringing them back to center and staying present and improving focus. But one of the things that it does for all young people that young people need in terms of their cognitive and social and emotional development is it helps them reflect. And, Dan Siegel talks a lot about the fourth R in education. So you have your reading, writing, arithmetic, but you also have reflection. And when we teach young people to reflect, the evidence shows that they're kinder to themselves, which is really important, especially for teenagers because it's a hard time. They're kinder to others. But also there's some really interesting studies coming out from Castle project, which looks at, it's a collaboration for academic, social and emotional learning. And their research is showing that when you teach young people to reflect and think about their emotional life, teach them how to respond to their emotions, how to slow down and stay present, it actually improves their academic performance. So the two things go hand in hand. So when you teach young people to be mindful, you're giving them tools for their social and emotional development, but you're also laying the foundation for academic development going forward as well. So it's really helpful.
Thanks, Trudy, for that. I think really interesting research that you've shared with us. So, Porrick, you mentioned the importance of compassion towards the end of your presentation, and how particularly how important it is for us to be compassionate with ourselves and with others. Can I ask you to share with us some ways, practical ways that we can develop that compassion in our lives?
Before I answer that, actually, what I would do is I would just go back to what Trudy said, because I think it's all linked, as the brain is obviously linked, everything is linked. And I think what staying in the present moment is all about is cultivating awareness so that you can reflect. Because the reality is that most human beings walking around are walking around on autopilot. If you're on autopilot, you are not going to be aware that your mind is wandering forward or behind you. And there's no self-awareness in what's going on. If you've no self-awareness, then really the wandering mind just takes over. So these anchoring techniques that I was just talking about in the last 15 minutes or so are really about grounding you first and anchoring you. And what you find is that when you stay in the present moment, suddenly you have this awareness of what's happening inside the machine. Now what you're doing is you're giving a greater voice to the prefrontal cortex or the upstairs brain. And now you're allowing the upstairs brain to say, hold on a sec, I can feel the limbic system downstairs actually heating up. I need to be able to regulate it. Whereas before, it's on autopilot, has no idea what's happening downstairs. When you stay in the present moment, you allow it to be aware, and then you allow it to reflect, and then you allow space to emerge, and you have a sensation of control, staying in the present, not projecting into the future. Now, one of the consequences, unfortunately, of becoming aware of what's happening downstairs or what's happening upstairs is that human beings start to give out to themselves, to be a little bit more negative, to say, I never realized I was doing this so often. I never realized that I was just tuning out. I didn't realize that was the consequence of me being forgetful, or me not listening to my kids, or whoever it is. And when that kind of negative thinking starts to come in, that can be associated with greater awareness, this is where a lack of compassion starts to make the issue worse. So what we need to do at this moment is to say, hold on, we're aware now, we know it's been happening, but you're a human being. And human beings, the nature of the mind is to wander like this. And actually, you know, we spend a long time in evolution trying to go from the downstairs brain to develop the upstairs one, but we're still not great at it all the time, right? And depending on what's happening in our lives, where there's significant stress, like a pandemic, for example, well, we have less control over these things. We tend to be more on autopilot. So when we create awareness, we need to be compassionate about what we find in there when we become more self-aware. And when we're compassionate, we allow the good and the bad to exist simultaneously. We allow for the fact that these things happen, that the mind wanders. We stay in the present, and we disengage from that kind of emotive negative thinking by allowing the upstairs brain to have more control over that kind of whole process, if that makes sense. So that's a long-winded answer to get back around to compassion, but how you start engaging in compassion is, and we have a good example of it on our website in terms of what's called loving kindness meditation, which is a basic practice where really you're training your mind, first of all, and it's really training your mind to love yourself. That's what it's about, really. And that sounds fuzzy, but that's a very powerful thing. You're training your mind to have compassion and respect for yourself, for the people you love, because that's easier to do, for the people that are your acquaintances, and also for the people actually you might not get on with. And this creates this very nice integration and control between upstairs and downstairs. And this is where compassion, for me, makes everything come full circle. It completes the whole thing, you know.
Thank you, Pork. Thank you for that. Trudy, Pork in his presentation spoke about the impact of anxiety, the negative impacts on the mind and the body. And I think many of us, particularly if we're working at home, we're exposed to a lot of information. We're being bombarded with figures every day. We're listening to the news. You turn on the TV in the evening, and all of that negativity is really impacting us. What can we do to combat some of this negativity in our lives at the moment?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think I don't want to say too much because Porrick has said a lot of really helpful things that people can do. But I think you make a good point when you talk about people who are working from home. I think it's a very specific situation that makes it even more challenging. Because our normal ways of coping with the wandering mind, as Porrick spoke about earlier, have been taken away from us. So I think the first thing people need to realize is that their environment has changed, and the strategies they normally used to cope with troubling thoughts or a wandering mind are gone, and you need to create new habits and new strategies, and you can't wait. The situation with the pandemic has a sense of impermanence, and it's put us all into this situation of, oh well, next week it'll be over, and then it'll be over, and I'll get back to work, and everybody's just holding their breath waiting. And so we're kind of stuck in this anxious waiting situation. But I think for everybody, it's important to just make a choice tomorrow morning. Tomorrow when you start your day, you're at home. This is your environment for now, and you want it to work for you. So to start thinking about making the environment work. So what a lot of people have been doing is what's known now, there's a new word for it, is doom scrolling, where you're constantly, and you find a bad news story and you find another one, and then it leads to another one. So we need to put in strategies to stop that. And there's some really cool things we can do. And there's a professor at Stanford University in the Brainstorm Lab for Mental Health Innovation. Her name is Nina Vasan. But she talks about little things you can do to make your technology work for you. So you're at home, you're stuck with your phone, you're doom scrolling. Stop doing it. You can stop doing it by changing your device. You can put your display, believe it or not, you can change your display to grayscale. So your phone is black and white. It's actually quite shocking when you do it. So it's less attractive. It's your brain is drawn to it less. That's a simple thing you can do. You can deliberately start finding links to happy stories. So something like the happy broadcast, put that on your news feed, and make a deliberate attempt to look for alternative stories. The other thing that's really helpful is to put distance between you and your devices, to physically put them away. You need to do that when you can, especially in the evening, to put it in another room, turn it off. The temptation is there. The minute you pick it up, you're drawn to it and you're doom scrolling before you know it. The other things that people can do, just some simple things, is really stuff that Porrick talked about is activation. So to be active in your life, so to actively do something, and to make space for that. And one of the ways we can do that is to limit the time that we engage in coronavirus related information. We all want to know what's going on, but put a bracket around it. Put a time. Maybe it's going to be the morning news on the radio. Maybe it's the 9 o'clock news in the evening. It's okay to engage with it, but limit the time that you engage in it. Have a worry window. It works for lots of different types of worries, and it will work very well for worrying about the coronavirus. Have a worry window, engage in the news, go to trusted sources if you can, because you don't want to get over worried unnecessarily. So go to resources that are trusted and that will give you factual information. And then bracket that off. And then in the other times when you're taking a break from work, do something that's not related to your device and not related to coronavirus or the news or doom scrolling.
Porrick, we're hearing a lot about the mental health fallout of COVID-19 and the impacts. You run a clinical practice. Could you share with us what you're seeing at the moment around the impact on mental health?
So what I've noticed actually is something that I find quite positive and uplifting, is that before or when the pandemic just hit, I was quite worried about some of my clients. I thought actually that this was really going to put people over the edge, especially some individuals who might have issues with anxiety related to health issues. And I really thought that this might really squeeze them and hurt them. But what I found, which was really surprising and I think fantastic and positive, was that because they'd acquired their own tools to manage anxiety over the last number of years, that the actual pandemic didn't seem to have as great an impact as it did on other people, let's say that I'd never seen before, who didn't have tools in the toolkit to help manage anxiety in general. So for me, that's a very positive thing, because it says to me that we can all acquire these skills. We can all acquire these tools. And there are a number of different tools out there. And, the same one won't work for everybody, but it's trial and error. And some people need to go and see a clinical psychologist or a psychotherapist or GP, and that's fine. Others don't. They can use the tools, let's say, that are on our website, for example. But the bottom line is that these tools, they certainly work.
That's really encouraging to hear, Porrick, that your clients are able to use the tools and the practices through this difficult time. So as we come to the end of our discussion this evening, I'd like to invite each of you to share what would be your key take-home message for people listening to this discussion?
So really, for me, Mary, the take-home message is what it says in the tin, which is to be present as much as you can. Have a look at the different tools that we discussed today. Pick one or two of them, give them a go, and put it into practice. Put reminders in your phone to help you practice this. Remember, the mind is plastic, the brain is plastic. It will move in accordance with your practice. But pick one or two of those tools that will help you stay in the present moment. And just remember that phrase, that the wandering mind is not a happy mind. So we need to stay present as long as we can, but also give yourself a break and have a look at the tools we described today.
Great advice. Thank you, Porrick. Trudy, what would your key take-home message be?
I think the big thing that I've learned, and I think it's important, I feel it's important to share with people, is that mindfulness is difficult, but it's doable. And there's different paths to it for everybody. I found, and I still find, being mindful really difficult. So if it's not working for you, like Pádraig said, there's lots of different ways to it. And things like yoga or Tai Chi or mindfully walking. Some people need movement and find just being still very difficult and very challenging. So there's lots of ways to do it. And if you're finding it really hard, that's okay. And there's lots of people who also find it hard. So it's okay for it to be difficult, but it's worth doing.
So I think really practical suggestions there around picking one or two of the tools. Pádraig shared many examples with us of anchors to stay in the present moment. Be compassionate with yourself, I think, is a key message coming out of our discussion. And I think I really like that, Trudy. For some people, it will be difficult, but it is doable. And to find what works for you, I think that's really the conclusion we're coming to. So that concludes our discussion this evening. I'd just like to thank Dr. Pádraig Dunn and Dr. Trudy Meehan for sharing your wonderful insights with us on managing coronaphobia and staying present. And the title of our final event is Future-Proofing Our Youth. I think a really, really important topic. For further information on the series and on any of the reports that we've referenced this evening, please do check out the RCSI website. And just before we close, a final reminder on that excellent online program, The Science of Health and Happiness. Full details will be available on the website.